Welcome to the Wade Center Podcast,
a podcast of Wheaton College.
So I think theologically that's problematic because, we were created in a special way. But if we leave out the created part, then what does the special way mean? What does it mean to be an image bearer that doesn't think of themselves as created by the Creator that we image?
Welcome to the Wade Center Podcast. I'm Jim Beitler, the director of the Wade Center, and I'm here with my co-host and our podcast producer, Aaron Hill. And today we are so delighted to be joined by Dr. Kristen Page. Dr. Page is the Ruth Kraft Stroshine Distinguished Chair and Professor of Biology at Wheaton College. She has been on the podcast before to talk about her book, The Wonders of Creation, Learning Stewardship from Narnia and Middle-earth. And I'd encourage you to have a listen to that if you haven't done so already, and maybe put that in your queue for the next podcast you listen to. But we wanted to have her back because there's just so much more to talk about. Material from her book, her current research, and the content of a course that we have co-taught together called J.R.R. Tolkien and Environmental Stewardship. So welcome back to the podcast, Kristen.
Thanks so much. It's really fun to be back.
So this book, The Wonders of Creation, this started out as a Hansen lectureship a couple years ago, and it got published as a book by IVP, as all of the Hansen lectureships have been. And I wondered if you might, for listeners who might have missed your last appearance, describe the book a little bit to us.
Sure. My premise in the book is that we can learn to develop a land stewardship or a land ethic, even if the only landscapes that we ever spend time in are fictional. So I spent a lot of time in Tolkien and Lewis's landscapes trying to see how it related to my own land ethic and tried to articulate in the book ways that people that are maybe a little bit skeptical of going outdoors into real landscapes might actually learn about land ethic through the writings of Tolkien and Lewis.
This is a point that both Chesterton and Tolkien talk about, and that is that reading fiction of this sort allows for a sense of recovery. You see the fantasy world, and you see how amazing it is, and that reminds you that the real world is pretty remarkable as well. So you see a golden apple, and you come back to the real world, and you see a red apple, and it's like, oh my goodness, that's a red apple. Apples are red. Or you see a dragon and in the story, and then you come back to the real world and see a horse. And it's just amazing to look at a horse with those fresh eyes. In some ways, your book is restoring that vision for us. And one of the things that I learned from you as we were teaching this course together was just how marvelous creation itself is. I felt like I got a sense of recovery from that.
Thanks.
But I wonder if you might be able to talk a little bit about the wonders of creation, some of the things that we find just marvelous in creation itself, kind of apart from fantasy stories.
Well, I've always marveled at creation. I can't remember a time when I wasn't outdoors looking under a rock or digging in the mud or looking at plants. And really, this creation that we live in, that we're part of, is just amazing. And I think that as we grow and we get busy with our adult lives, we forget to explore and dig in the mud and look under rocks. And so this book gave me the opportunity. I never really lost that sense in my life too much, but the book really helped revive in me the passion of taking time to look around and just marvel at all of the amazing things that have been created and that are in creation for us to enjoy. So, I could tell you about so many things. Where do you want me to start?
I want you to start with elephants.
Elephants.
Or oliphants.
Oliphants.
Yeah.
I love elephants. I've always loved elephants. I had toy elephants as a child. I love to read about elephants. When I first started teaching at Wheaton, I had the amazing privilege of visiting a student in Tanzania through the Human Needs and Global Resources program, or we call it Hunger here.
A great program.
Yeah. And I was with Nathaniel, and he worked, he was doing an internship with Africa Wildlife Foundation. And we were out near Tarangire National Park, but at the time where we were wasn't really protected. And he said, hey, Dr. Page, I met some scientists, and they said that we could go out with them today. So we jumped in the Jeep, and we're driving across the savannah, and all of a sudden, there was an elephant I could touch it. It was so close. I didn't, but I could have.
Was it a wild elephant?
It was a wild elephant.
Oh, wow.
And the researchers referred to her as Eleanor.
Oh.
And I know something about having a name.
Yeah.
It makes it more wonderful, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And she just kind of looked at us and put her trunk up and sniffed at us. And I was like just jaw dropped.
Yeah.
Just couldn't believe the beauty that I was seeing. And then to learn about the way that elephants communicate from these scientists. And I mean, they communicate a lot of ways. So when they're close to each other, through touch and through smell and through vocalizations that we can hear.
Mm-hmm.
But when they're far away from each other, they have these vocalizations that are subsonic, that we can't even hear them. But they travel so far in those ecosystems that they can communicate over distances of tens to hundreds of miles. And they can feel vibrations from storms, or at least this is what is believed is happening. Because when a storm comes into one part of their large territory, they will move ahead of time towards that storm because they will go to where the rain is so that they can have the vegetation to eat. And so it's believed, from my reading, it's believed that they can either feel the vibrations of the thunder or they're responding in some way that we can't hear or feel, but they can.
Wow.
To find their way to the renewed landscape from the rain.
That's so cool.
And there's a connection to Tolkien, of course, right?
Of course, because Sam, like me, really wanted to see oliphants. I mean, I'd love to see an oliphant too.
Yeah, and when he did, he fell asleep.
He did. Well, I was rereading that passage today, and I was just struck by, he was like, "Oh, there are oliphants. I saw one." And he just was so content. He went to sleep. It's like you want to see something your whole life. You want to believe that it's true. And you knew in your heart that it really was something that existed.
Yeah.
And then you experience it and you're like, it was promised to me. I knew that it was true. And now I'm at peace because I've seen it.
It's hard because we live in a world where through National Geographic or, pictures on the internet or whatever, you can see, somebody training an elephant, on the other side of the planet. And so we just don't have that. There's almost a loss of a sense of awe and wonder. I mean, it's amazing because you can watch these great nature documentaries that you would never be able to see all these amazing things that are happening. But at the same time, you don't hear somebody talk about a creature, see an illustration, but that you've never seen them, like, you like Sam, and then you see him.
Right.
So I don't know. There's a loss of a sense of wonder, I think, of like I can just pull up a picture of anything on my phone.
Oh, that instant gratification causes a diminishment of wonder, I think.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways.
The other bit of wonder that I encountered in our course was we were reading Braiding Sweetgrass, and there are lots of examples in that book.
So many.
But the one that sticks out to me, it's by the book is by Robin Wall Kimmerer, and I'd encourage you to check it out, listeners to check it out. But the one that sticks out to me is the example of the goldenrod and the aster. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I think that when I first read this book, that part of the book where Robin Wall Kimmerer is talking about her first year in college, and she is going to study botany, and she goes to see her advisor, and the advisor says, "Why do you want to study botany?" And she said, "Because I want to know why goldenrod and aster bloom at the same time." So goldenrod is this beautiful yellow, and the aster she's talking about is this gorgeous purple. And he says, you're majoring in the wrong thing. You need to go study art. And thankfully, she didn't listen to him, and she stayed and she pursued this science. But it turns out that the reason that goldenrod and aster bloom together, well, maybe because God knows it's beautiful, but it spans the spectrum of visual light. And so it's attracting way more pollinators than if one bloomed by itself. So by blooming together, they're attracting more pollinators than they would if they just bloomed separately at different times.
Huh.
Isn't that wonderful?
That's crazy.
So when you learn something like that, the first experience is wonder, right? And then you think to yourself, I want to study that. And you start to study it. Does that study, the scholarship, the research that you're doing, does that then diminish the wonder, or does it do the opposite?
Well, for me, it doesn't diminish the wonder. There's always something new that I'll learn that I'm going to be wondering about. I think for me, and I think for most people, if they're honest, if they are really experiencing wonder and they want to know more about it, will make them want to know more about it. And it just deepens their appreciation. And I think it extends the wonder to know more and more and more about something. I mean, I don't get to go and study elephants. I can read more about them, and it does make me wonder even more. I've gotten to see elephants again since that time, and it's no less wonderful the next time I saw them. Even when I see them in pictures, I wonder at them.
So you were talking about elephant communication, but trees communicate too. This is another thing I learned from our course. So, we're talking about Tolkien. There are talking trees, right? We have Treebeard.
Right.
He's a liminal being, so kind of he's a sentient creature, but also a tree. But trees actually communicate.
It seems that way. There's a lot of scholarship that would suggest that there are different kinds of communications between different trees. So one really famous scientist who has done a lot of work on communication of trees is Suzanne Simard. And she wrote a book called Finding the Mother Tree. It's also a really great book. The listeners might want to check that one out too. But what she discovered is, it's not communication necessarily the way that we communicate, right? So it's not like Treebeard is talking to us so we can hear it, but trees communicate through, her scholarship shows that they communicate through molecules. So like a mother tree can send more of her nutrition to her genetic offspring than to other saplings in the same forest. And so there's got to be some communication. How does she know where they are, where to send
what they need?
Oh,
wow.
There are other scientists who have looked at the growth of plants and discovered that some roots are producing sound at 220 hertz. So if you're a musician, you might recognize that that's an A, because 440 is what orchestra's tuned to.
Yeah.
And I thought that was just like, when I read that, I was like, wow, that is so cool. Instruments that are made of wood tune to the same frequency or an octave higher as some plants emit into the soil. I think that's amazing. I mean,
that's crazy.
I don't think that I have enough time left in my career to study all of the things that I want to study, but that's a really cool one.
This is just a taste of what I feel like I experienced in our course. I just felt like one of the benefits of co-teaching is that you're a learner again.
Yeah.
And so I was just like learning every day from you. And I think one of the things that I was learning from you was how to read differently. Landscape for sure, but also Lord of the Rings, this book that I've read many, many times. I was suddenly reading it differently. So one day in class, I was talking about Tom Shippey's argument about the complexity of the number of voices that appear in the Council of Elrond chapter of The Lord of the Rings. So Shippey points out that there are just so many voices that Tolkien introduces in a chapter where nothing much happens. And he's able to weave all of these voices together, and they all have different characteristics. So it's just this remarkable chapter. And Kristen pointed out that there were other voices in the text as well that Shippey hadn't mentioned. And that it was things like the wind in the trees. I'll never forget that conversation.
Oh, wow.
And so there were all of these ecological matters that were happening in the text. I wonder if you might talk a little bit more about some of those.
Yeah, so I think that I learned a lot from you as well, and because I've never studied literature formally, right? So, but I love to read, and so as I'm reading and being instructed in how to think about it from a literary point of view, that's super helpful. And I think because of that, I'm able to see something. I haven't read it as many times as you, but I've read it more than twice now. And I didn't necessarily notice those other voices until we were in class and you were instructing us about all of the different voices. And then I thought, oh, well, yeah. And as an ecologist, I'm going to see the wind, and I don't remember all of the voices that I pointed out, but I think I do remember the wind was really an important voice in terms of the conversations that they were having. And Tolkien didn't, it wasn't just me reading into it. It was mentioned, and, the wind was mentioned. And so...
also, you talked also about the hedgerows, I think.
Oh, yeah, because hedgerows will divert the wind in different ways. So hedgerows break up landscapes, and they change ecological processes. So like think about if you can go through like this visual exercise. I often make my students do this. Okay, so in your mind, don't put your coat on. It's middle of winter. and you're going to walk outside and you're going to walk out into a cornfield, and the wind is blowing like you wouldn't believe. It's really cold, right? But if you've ever spent any time in the Midwest and you've gone into the ag fields, you see that there are rows of trees along those fields.
Yes.
And those tree rows are there to break wind.
Not like that, but
Not
yeah.
like that. The trees are that's hilarious. The trees are there to stop the wind and slow it down before it increases erosion on those fields. And right. And so like in Tolkien, when Tolkien is describing this council and he's describing the landscape, I mean, Tolkien describes the landscape on every page. You can visualize every place you are when you're in Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
Especially even if you haven't spent time outside in the real world, I still think that the way he describes it, you can conjure a picture that's very close to what the agricultural landscape might look like, or even an English garden. So hedgerows, the word hedgerow is more like bushes, like not tall trees, but bushes. But it is going to funnel the wind differently. It's going to make the sound different. If you duck behind a bush, you're changing what you're experiencing from the soundscape. Then if you walk out on the other side, and then you hear the wind again. So anyway, I don't remember exactly what I said during class, but that's what comes to mind right now.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you a question based on your book, and this is also, I know something you've talked about elsewhere, and I guess it's something I think about as well, so I thought it would be good to talk about. So in your first chapter, you quote from The Magician's Nephew, this passage about the wood between the worlds, and it's this beautiful passage, and you're trying to drive home the point that Lewis is talking about, like the stillness of the forest and how it quiets our souls. But he has this passage where he says that it had no birds, no insects, no animals, and no wind. And when I was rereading your book the other day, I felt like, that feels like a description of the way that a lot of people want the outdoors to be. Like when we make an illustration of a forest, it's like there's trees. There may be a mountain there, but nobody's drawing bugs into their illustrations of the forest. There may be like one animal. It's like a fox or a wolf, is like silhouetted, but that's about it. But, and you see this with trends with like glamping and all of these ways of getting out in nature, but without actually like getting your hands dirty or seeing bugs or camping on the ground. My wife and I bought a rooftop tent so we can camp, out west and stuff. But it's like, we don't want the animals to
nibble your toes,
to bother us when we're in our tent, when we're safe on the top of our car. And so, knowing that this is something you tackle in chapter 2 of your book, but it also reminded me of your essay that you wrote, your interdisciplinary essay that you wrote, Loving Our Neighbor's Responsibility in the Created World, which I don't know, is that available online that people could read?
We'll have to find a way to do that.
Okay.
No, it's not.
It should be. It's really great.
I don't know where to put it.
Oh, it's really great.
We'll find a place.
Kristen wrote like an interdisciplinary essay where she's talking about biology and theology and what it means to love our neighbor. It's a fascinating essay. So I'm not implying that Lewis doesn't like bugs.
He might not,
but
a lot of people don't.
I don't recall hearing him or remember him talking about bugs in one of his books. He does talk about animals and talking animals and stuff like that. But it just got me thinking of, what does it say about our theology, about our imagination, that we almost always leave out the fullness of creatures? We don't think about ecosystems much. I think when we're thinking about the outdoors, we tend to think about these sort of romanticized, almost pasteurized versions of the outdoors. And I think it says something about our theology of creation and the way in which it's deficient. And I feel like you talk about that in chapter 2, but you've talked about that in other places. And I wanted to just kind of pick your brain on that.
I think that it comes down to how we position ourselves in creation, right? So if I'm in creation set apart from it, then I don't want to have to deal with mosquitoes and cicada mites and all the
oak leaf itch mites.
Oh my gosh.
They are really itchy. For those of you not in the Midwest.
I did not get any sleep last night because I got bites all over me because I went for a bike ride and they got all over me yesterday.
They're really bad. Yeah.
I
have them
right
too.
Here. Yeah.
For our non-Midwest listeners, these are mites that feed off of the larvae of cicadas.
I think they're eating the eggs.
The eggs of cicadas, and we just had this huge brood of cicadas. So now we have a huge amount of oak leaf itch mites.
They are itchy. Very itchy.
I was literally telling my wife the other day, I was like, "What? Am I getting bit by mosquitoes? Where are all these bites coming from?" She sends me this video, and I'm like, "Oh, that's great." Now I'm creeped out. I had to go take a shower right away.
Sadly, they're gone once they're itching.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
it makes you feel better.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that we think about the world like Eden, right? So when we read about Eden, we're just thinking about, God put us in Eden and we have all the food we need and it's easy and it's beautiful and we don't have to worry about all of these bugs and diseases and things that are outside of Eden after the fall. And so we don't think about ourselves even now as part of creation. We were created. We are created beings and we're part of creation. And what we do in nature and creation impacts it and it impacts us. But we prefer to think about our experiences, pursuing wonder or whatever. A lot of people run with their AirPods in and they're not hearing, the sounds.
Yeah.
Or they're hustling through, a national park in their car and they stop and they get out and they look at something.
Take their picture.
Take the picture and
selfie.
go. It's a very Instagram world without the things that itch and bite and scare us or bug us. We don't like to think of ourselves as part. So I think theologically that's problematic because, we can't just leave out the part that we were created. I mean, we were created in a special way.
Yeah.
But if we leave out the created part, then what does the special way mean?
Yeah.
What does it mean to be an image bearer that doesn't think of themselves as created by the creator that we image?
Yeah. You talk about in chapter 2 in the book about the scouring of the Shire, and I was kind of sad that it only showed up as like a vision in the movies. It doesn't really, wasn't depicted, because I feel like it is a very heroic moment for the hobbits, but it also has something to say about like a land ethic, because they come home and this thing that people have romanticized, and they travel all the way to New Zealand to go see this movie set that was turned into a real place, Hobbiton or whatever. To see that destroyed. There's a message there, and we kind of overlook that. And I like how you highlight Saruman and how he goes from someone who studied the forest to someone who only sees it as a tool for him to use. And I think that mentality of seeing it as a tool, creation is there for us to either use or not use or avoid. But it's either a hindrance or it's a tool. It's a natural resource that we can just, squeeze and use up for profit or for our own good or for our own convenience. And so I like how in chapter 2 you highlight, you kind of expand out the scouring of the Shire. I thought that was a really powerful way to draw out Tolkien in that section there.
Yeah, I think when I was reading that, as I was thinking about the book, I was really struck by how I live in a way like the hobbits did, where I just consume without thinking about it. And it has implications. So the way that I'm living, because I'm not perfect, I would like to live differently all the time with regard to consumption, but I sadly fail that often. But I am reminded, I think that when we get to be in that moment with the hobbits and see what they see after they return, they're like, oh, but this didn't just happen while we were away. We participated in this. It might have accelerated while we were away, but we're not without blame for the things that have happened here. And I'm not without blame for what's happening in the world around me with regards to climate change and overuse of resources and all of the injustices that come with when we don't think about the proper use of resources or we don't think about our proper position in creation.
Yeah.
One thing for me that started to help me find that in a small way was, again, going on like walks with you in class. Everybody should go on a walk with Dr. Kristen Page.
We'll create a sign-up sheet and
I don't think you want that, but it is quite an experience. I mean, it's like first of all, you're going to go very slowly. And I just have this image from our class of walking. We were at a state park.
Oh yeah, we went to Medewin.
We went to Medewin State Park, and the students are clustered around Kristen, and we're moving at a very slow speed. And rather than the instructor setting the agenda, the world is setting the agenda for what we're going to be talking about that day. I think, and it's just remarkable. It's like you're in ancient Greece with a philosopher, and you're dialoguing, but you're actually dialoguing with the world, and the world is asking questions of you.
It's just fun to walk and to hear the students, like as you force them to walk slowly. Well, I walk slowly because I'm stopping every 2 millimeters to pick up something, or, or to take a picture, or to, wow, look how pretty this blue is, or but then they start to see things a little bit differently, and they start to ask questions like, why would that tree be out there all by itself, or why are we seeing the species of plants together here, kind of like the Aster and goldenrod question, or it's just a lot of fun. I loved reading about Tolkien and Lewis and the ways that they walked.
Yes.
Tolkien definitely took a long time because he was stopping and looking at everything.
Right, but that's how it is when you read their books too, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when you're reading Tolkien, you can go pages and you didn't go anywhere because he's looking off the trail.
Yeah.
But Lewis, you just kind of, or at least when I think about Lewis, I feel like you're going at a little bit bigger scope, a little bit bigger speed. You're seeing more of the landscape, and that really reflects the way that they went on hikes and they did walking. Not that Lewis didn't pay attention to what was around him, but I'm definitely more like Tolkien when I go for a walk. I'm picking up things and looking, and very slow. We don't go for distance.
Mary Oliver, the writer, said that attention is the beginning of devotion. Is there a connection for you between paying attention and spiritual life?
Oh, sure. I when I'm hustling around, you just kind of succumb to the busyness. But when I'm out in nature and walking and thinking about the beauty and the amazing relationships that are present that I get to learn about, I just really, it's prayer. I just understand a little more of the Creator. And I know that if He's created an acorn with a beautiful cap, He loves me so much. I mean, I don't know. I've always felt very able to pray and to understand Scripture and just experience my faith more when for me, it's a forest, but when I'm out in nature than if I'm sitting in a chair in my living room trying to have a quiet time.
You're a photographer too.
Mm-hmm.
That's part of it, right? The paying attention. How did you get into photography?
I really got into photography because of a professor I had in college, and I went to my senior year. I went on a study abroad to Costa Rica and Galapagos in Ecuador, and one of the assignments was we had to turn in a photo, one photo. We had to pick one photo that kind of illustrated an important lesson. And I took a picture of a red-billed tropic bird, and they migrate farther than any other bird species, I believe.
Oh, wow.
And it was a female, and she was hovering at a cliff, and she was trying to get to her nest to kind of check on her nestlings, but it was too dangerous to land too often. And I was just so amazed that species can persist that have like these huge odds, right? They have to fly from pole to pole, and then they nest on cliffs with wind gusts that blow them away when they're trying to get to their young. And I don't know. So capturing that picture and thinking about why I took that picture kind of hooked me on photography. And so, I don't know, I process the world, I think a lot through my camera. And I feel like I can maybe be a little bit outside of myself because I'm looking through my eyepiece and on my camera. I can also get in really close and I can see patterns that I wouldn't see just with my eye. Maybe it's the artist in me. I like to try to compose something pretty that reflects how I'm feeling when I'm in a place.
It makes you pay attention, though.
I think so.
Yeah.
And that's something you asked our students to do.
Because
we had Kristen came up with a natural history notebook assignment. Maybe you want to talk about that.
So naturalists are people who do a lot of things like I do, like spending a lot of time walking slowly through a place and documenting it in different ways. And one thing that many naturalists do is they like to draw. And I think if to be forced to draw something makes you pay attention to it in a different way. I'm not asking the students to be an artist. I'm just asking them to pay attention to things. So we spent a lot of time outdoors. We had a landscape journal. We'll probably talk about that in a minute. An assignment where the students were expected to spend 30 minutes at a time in quiet without their phones in the same place over and over and over again. And so they had a lot of opportunity to notice life around them. And so we had them pick 2 real species. So maybe white oak or morel mushroom or anything that they saw that they wanted to explore, and they had to draw it, and they had to make a notebook entry for it. So they had to describe the natural history of the species, and then they also had to do the same thing for a fictional species. So it could be something that they made up, or it could be something that Tolkien made up, or
Nice.
And it was really fun. I have it in my office. It's one of my favorite things. I love looking at it. We made it digital, and so everybody got a copy, but I have the original in my office, and I look at it a lot.
That's really neat.
It's a really fun artifact, and I just think about how many illustrations have come out of the world of Tolkien, and then how that feeds a recovery of an interest in our own world. I mean, Tolkien himself loved to draw the picture of the tree of Amalion, which was this tree that was an image for him of his kind of world of tales, and he drew it over and over. So yeah.
So I, as I was rereading your book, I was reminded of, and I don't know if you've ever heard of this before, but there's one of the earliest expositions of the book of Genesis was written by Saint Basil of Caesarea. He actually inspired Saint Augustine, and so Saint Augustine actually sat through a series of homilies that Ambrose gave on creation and Genesis, and he used Basil's hexameron as his sort of preparation notes for his sermons. So you can draw a line between Basil and Augustine, these early church fathers. But what it got me thinking of is you were talking about Lewis and giving all these examples about creation, and it got me thinking about the way that Lewis depicts animals, talking animals. And I think we sort of undervalue the importance of the idea that there's all these animals in the Chronicles of Narnia that you're learning valuable lessons from. You know, they're speaking truth. They're actually like bearing witness to the faith. And then, in the end, they end up going to the Narnia version of heaven. And so this idea that we would be there alongside these sentient animals, my wife and I had this discussion the other day about like what would happen if all of a sudden animals could talk, like how it would change the world. But anyways, it got me thinking about this hexameron by Saint Basil. And I was looking back at it, and I came across this passage I wanted to share with you and just get your opinion on. So in talking about the creation of the animals, he's making an argument that the psalmist in Psalm 19 is telling us that, the heavens declare the glory of God, and, creation pours forth speech. And he argues that means we can learn about who God is by studying animals. And I'm like, this guy in the 300s already had this figured out. But he writes, what lesson do these animals teach man? They not only show us in our Creator a care which extends to all beings, but a certain intuitive feeling about the future, a desire to take care of themselves and their kin, even in brutes. And he goes on to argue basically that we can learn about God and what it looks like to live a virtuous life by studying creation. Now, he has a lot of like really outdated ideas about animals. You would probably really get a kick out of, and there's a whole section where he's like, we're not sure if the earth is a sphere or a cylinder or if it's hollow on the inside. And so his science is definitely very much outdated. But one of the sections he talks about the gratitude of dogs, quote, shames all who are ungrateful to their benefactors. So he has all these really great lines in there. But then he has this one I wanted to share with you. He says, beasts bear witness to the faith. And to me, that it reminded me of Chronicles of Narnia, and just this idea that there's more, part of the reason that why we should study creation is not just because it's neat or because there's wonder or we have a question about, yellow and purple flowers or whatever the case is, but that we might be able to learn something about who God is.
Oh, yeah.
And so I just kind of wanted to pick your brain about that. Obviously, and then Jim, maybe you want to speak to this as well. Obviously, Chronicles of Narnia, Tolkien, that creation is almost testifying in their stories as well. But have you had those kinds of experiences yourself about sort of learning something about who God is or what it means to be a virtuous person by studying creation, by studying animals?
Well, I can't think of a specific example of, wow, I saw this, but there's just so much about animals that we don't know. We often project our own understanding of the world onto animals, right? And so it's very hard. I teach my students about perception in ecology. We talk about, like, how does an animal decide where to stop? How does it decide where its habitat is?
Yeah.
Right? If I'm studying mice and how mice determine where to stop in a landscape, but I'm not a mouse. I'm about 5'10" taller than a mouse, right? So how can I perceive the landscape like a mouse would? But I think that because we project our own understanding of the world onto animals, we forget that they have their own life and their own experiences. And I mean, I think I just have been reading a bunch of books about birds by Ackerman, and it's just so fascinating to learn, like, how birds are communicating or how they know where to return. So they have, we call it site fidelity. Like, so if they hatch in one little forest, they will come back somewhere very close. How do they do that?
Yeah.
I'm not sure what it exactly tells me about the creator beyond he just really loves his creation, and he's given everything that he created the capacity to survive and be successful and live and interact. And I think that that's probably the biggest thing is we aren't good at thinking of ourselves in relationship with anything but people. People and God. We're good at thinking about our relationship with God.
Yeah.
But we're not good at thinking about our relationship with the land or our relationship with other organisms. And without those other organisms, we wouldn't be doing so well.
Yeah.
And so, I think that for me, I learn a lot about the importance of relationship to God when I study ecology or I study animals or I study the world.
Tolkien's fantasy worlds fulfill a desire that we have. He talks about this in On Fairy Stories. He says that fantasy speaks to, and this is a quote, fantasy speaks to our desire to visit, free as a fish, the deep sea, or the longing for the noiseless, gracious, economical flight of a bird. And then he talks about profounder wishes that fantasy speaks to, one of which is the desire to converse with living things. There's something about being human. We want to be able to commune with creation. It seems like we've lost it. But fantasy can help restore it. So we're wired to want to be a part of, participate in creation in some way.
We're created. That's why.
Yeah, we're created. So,
Well, so I have I guess, kind of a wrap-up question. You wrote your book, Wonders of Creation. You got a chance to dig through the archives of the Wade. You pulled out some really neat quotes and letters. I thought it was neat. You found some letters about Lewis talking about, walking through the woods and the things that he saw and stuff like that. You studied biology, you studied, creation, quote unquote, capital C creation. You're not a trained literature professor like Jim is, but where do you see the role of literature and fiction sort of moving forward in the work that you do and trying to help people appreciate and understand creation?
I think that literature gives me a point of connection with a lot of different people. And so, I'm not sure that I'll do a lot of projects where I'm digging through literature to try to, something similar to this, although I have some ideas. But what it does do, I love to have these conversations. Like a student will ask me a question. I'm like, oh, well, have you read this book? And usually the books that I'm suggesting aren't like nonfiction. They're usually fiction, And so have you been in this landscape? Have you been to this place that this author created? Especially like Richard Powers or, the Overstory or, there are just so many good books out there that you can be immersed in and learn something about the world, or even like sci-fi where it's not actually this world, but you learn something about this world because you are in some fictional world that makes enough sense
Yeah.
that you can see our world differently.
Yeah.
And so, I love to use fiction in my science classes. I love to just bring in a passage from often Lord of the Rings. That's usually what it is. In my ecology class, and say, okay, describe this ecosystem. What's going on? Do an ecosystem assessment of this forest of Mirkwood. And tell me like what's gone on? What have people done in there? What have other species done? How are these relationships resulting in this landscape that Tolkien has created? So they can use the tools that they've developed in the real world and go into this fictional world and see that what I've learned, I can still apply it in a fictional place. And I think they have a lot of fun doing that. But it also helps them realize that, I've learned this and I actually understand more about this world that I'm living in than I did before I spent time in Mirkwood Forest.
Yeah.
We've got to give Kristen a chance to plug her own podcast.
Oh, yeah. We heard about this.
Yes, because she has been doing research on soundscapes, and this podcast is connected to that.
Right. So because of this book, The Wonders of Creation, I was just fascinated by the ways that organisms communicate and sounds and how sounds make us feel. And so I started just reading a lot and going around and collecting recordings of soundscapes. And so I have this library now of all these sounds. The coolest probably is I went to Alaska in the winter, and it's so quiet. But I put my microphone under the snow, down a vole hole, and you can hear its heart beating.
No.
Whoa.
Yeah. It's so beautiful. It's so cool.
Wow.
And so I have this beautiful library of sounds, and I just started thinking about the stories that I am learning through listening to the world. And so I created a podcast called Listen Here, and it's just about the soundscapes and the stories that I'm hearing when I'm listening to the soundscape. So it's a baby podcast. It has 3 episodes. We're only 2.5, but it's on all of the platforms.
Okay. Yeah, we'll link to it in the description.
So
yeah.
So my first one is about cicadas.
Oh.
So
Oh my gosh.
I might have to go back and do one about the itchy mites.
Yeah.
Although they don't sound like anything.
My wife's Apple Watch gave her a noise warning that she should move out of the area, that it was too loud. It was like 95 decibels in our backyard.
Yes, that's what we measured as well. And 85 decibels is the max that you want to be exposed to but that's only less than an hour.
Yeah.
And it was 60 decibels in our house with all the doors and windows closed. So it was really loud.
Well, there you have. Tune in to Listen Here with Kristen Page.
Thank you.
We'll check it out.
And thank you. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the Wade Podcast. It was great to have you here.
So much fun to be with you.
Yeah, definitely.
Bye.
The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. Our hosts are the co-directors of the Wade Center, Drs. Crystal and David C. Downing. Our episodes are produced and edited by Aaron M. Hill. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave us a review on iTunes, tell your friends, and consider making a donation to the Wade. The Wade Center is entirely self-funded. Financial gifts help support the expert services, vast collections, and varied programming we offer at no cost. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, what we offer, and how to make a donation, visit our website at wheaton.edu/Wade.